Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy is sponsored by Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with the intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Products include Westlaw, Practical Law, and Firm Central legal practice management software for small law firms. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. Federal Credit Union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the Greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is Life Illuminated. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan, acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. A Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology. Look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns. Alan Miller with you. And we have a return guest as well. We impose upon him, hopefully about once a year, Steve Hunegs, who is the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Now tell us what that is.
Thank you, Alan. I love being on the show. Great to see Sharon. Great to see all the volunteers who make this work. So I'm very proud to be invited to participate once a year. Whenever you need me, I'm there, okay?
We also, I'm breaking in a lot of guest hosts. Would you be interested? I'll solicit you right here on air.
I don't know if my skill set matches, but an adventure. I'll try it.
Patrick was here a couple of weeks ago, did a great job. Patrick Klinger. We've had about a half dozen.
Well, if Patrick's there,
I'm looking to the future.
It should be a long ways away, let's put it that way. But someone once said about John Wooden, don't follow a legend, so I'm not sure I want to follow Patrick, but we'll give it a shot anyways.
Okay, that's good to know.
At JCRC, Minnesota and the Dakotas, we're in a way, the public relations voice of the Jewish community of the three states. What does that encompass? Well, civil rights, constituent services, lobbying the government on behalf of the Jewish social service agencies, which serve both the Jewish and non-Jewish community, Israel advocacy from an upper Midwest perspective, Holocaust education, and then all the relationships that make up each of those silos.
In other words, putting on the public face.
They're putting on the public face, but substantively too, we do a lot of programming, we do a lot of education, and we're 225,000 square miles between North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. It's a wonderful job.
You've been with this now since what, 2005?
Close. So December 1, 2006. 10 years on December 1st, but your memory is excellent as usual.
And good, congratulations. Happy anniversary almost.
Thank you, thank you. It will be a great milestone to celebrate, let's put it that way, as long as my board keeps having me.
Well, I think they're very happy from what I've heard.
Well, I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to work for such a great community.
Now, you said, let's talk about happy things
Exactly.
today. So give me some happy news, because I have some unhappy questions.
Well, that's okay, but let's start on the positive. We're talking about a piece I wrote for MinPost. 60th anniversary of not 60th anniversary, pardon me, Democratic Convention 2016, Philadelphia. The first time since Democrats have met in Philadelphia since '48, when Hubert Humphrey gave his famous speech, March Forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. When I was working as an assistant attorney general, Skip Humphrey asked me to work on a project. had an opportunity to go to the Minnesota Historical Society looking into the archives of his father. And I came upon the most wonderful letter. It is written by a gentleman representing what was called the Progressive Voters League of Florida. In the letter it said, representing 60,000 Negro voters in Florida. Now there's like 1.25 million African American voters in Florida. Think of the courage it took to vote as an African American in a southern state in 1948. Poll taxes, any number of forms of intimidation.
There are a lot of states where it still takes a lot of courage for someone who is not Caucasian to vote.
And I'll put in a plug, thank you, Alan, for the Voting Rights Reauthorization Act, which would reverse some of the issues of the Shelby v. Holder Supreme Court case, which deprived the Justice Department of some of their most important tools in enforcing Voting Rights Act cases. Not partisan by any stretch. Democratic supporters, Republican supporters of this legislation.
In the last 2 weeks, at least 6 court decisions overturning voter suppression laws in a variety of states, including our neighbor, Wisconsin.
There's a case, the United States Supreme Court commitment to voting rights goes back to the 19th century. A famous case called Yickwo versus Hopkins had this wonderful quote. And the quote is, "The right to vote is the preservative of all others." Spin back to what we were talking about before, this letter from the Humphrey Archive from the gentleman from Florida. He said something that struck me. He said, we are at a crossroads in this country because the Democratic Party was facing this epical issue over civil rights. The party itself was badly divided between the more liberal element, the northern element, and the southern element, which was generally opposed to most forms of civil rights. So the piece I wrote for MinnPost was Crossroads to Philadelphia in 1948, because you had all these forces converging. You had Humphrey and the more liberal element of the Democratic Party strongly advancing civil rights. You had Truman, a great president, someone hesitant, however, on civil rights. You had the southern part of the party resistant to civil rights, and then you had all these other overhanging issues for the Democrats.
The Democratic Party lost a lot of the South as a result of that.
Ultimately, particularly in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, I think Lyndon Johnson, either signing the 64 Civil Rights Act or the 65 Voting Rights Act, said, we've more or less lost the South. That was his comment at the time. Of course, the greater good was promoting this incredibly important civil rights legislation. The good news was, of course, Humphrey made the great speech, maybe the speech of his career right at the outset of his career. Certainly it gave him national profile. And the Democrats adopted the minority plank, which was a strong federal legislation minority plank. By the way, and this is important, speaking of bipartisanship, part of what moved the Democratic Party in 1948 was the fact that the Republicans had already adopted a platform plank which was very strong on civil rights. So the Democrats were actually trailing the Republicans in 1948 on that issue.
I'll try that one today.
Well, that may not be so much the reality now, but in 48, that was the reality, and it's very important to remember that fact. In fact, the 48, it's interesting, the 48 plank of the Republican platform on civil rights talks about the sacrifice on the battlefields, which of course was sort of an oblique way of noting the Civil War and what the North had given in order to win the Civil War and end slavery, and then pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the aftermath of the war.
But the other side of the coin is that we face some of the same problems today that we faced 60-some years ago, 70 years ago, with people trying to diminish the right to vote by putting in these artificial blocks.
Our organization is a civil rights organization, and we, as I said, we strongly support the Voting Rights Reauthorization Act, VRAA. Our organization, born in the civil rights era, 1939, facing issues of significant anti-Semitism in the Twin Cities and throughout the upper Midwest, but also the rigid social exclusion of Jews, Japanese Americans, and African Americans, particularly in Minneapolis. That's also, as part of my piece, was the fact that what Humphrey learned, Brandeis called the states the laboratories of democracy. What Humphrey learned in Minneapolis, passing amongst the first open housing and anti-job discrimination ordinances of the country, he took to Washington, D.C., which helped him craft, along with many, many other people and many, many other organizations, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. When he asked me to talk about happy things, that was a great outcome.
That was. And it was signed by who? Lyndon Johnson, who was never known as a great civil rights advocate in years past, but became really the focal point of that bill.
Well, when you figure that, he really needed 66 votes. I mean, it took critical Republican votes, people like Everett Dirksen, in order to make the in order to enable the 1964 Civil Rights Act to pass. I think we have to.
He was great at crossing the line to the other party and being persuasive.
It's true.
And much more than I think the president has today. I think this president, for all the good that he has done, has really been unfairly stymied by a party that refuses to do virtually anything that he proposes.
Of course, we're a nonpartisan, bipartisan entity, so I'm not here to comment about
you are,
one
but
party
I'm
not. or another, other than to say, we can all hearken back to an era when there was greater bipartisanship and perhaps a vain hope, but we all wish for a time in the future, hopefully in the near future, where there will be more of the cooperation. Take food stamps, for instance. Who worked together so closely? It was George McGovern, Bob Dole, Hubert Humphrey, any number of Midwestern Republicans and Democrats, knowing that that was important for the farming economy and to feed people in this country, right? Completely bipartisan effort. That's what we need more of.
We need much more of it.
Indeed.
And I frankly cannot understand how any minority, any African American, any Latino, any woman, any LGBT individual could possibly vote for Donald Trump in this upcoming election. Now, I understand you can't respond to that, but I will respond from your conscience and say, I agree with you, because he's against everything that we stand for and that we have fought for over the years.
Let's look at this part of the picture, and this is a general overall framing. We're now migrating from some of the more salutary subjects that we were discussing to more difficult subjects.
If I take a swing, by the way, it's not at you, it's this one little bug which is flying around here.
You might not be the first person to take a swing at me, but that's a different story. But this presidential election, sadly, unfortunately, and it's reflective of larger cultural concerns, has generated significant anti-Semitism.
That's
the right.
one of the things I
on
want
the
to
right.
talk about.
We can start on the right or the left.
Both here and what's going on in Europe, because it's really been fermenting in Europe.
Starting on the right, some of the issues which you were just referencing has precipitated, for instance, Jewish journalists covering the Trump campaign have been subject to vile anti-Semitic comments, not by Donald Trump, but by his followers, particularly on social media. Serious situation. On the left, associated with the unfortunate anti-Israel element in the Democratic Party, unfortunately growing larger these days. Say that Ken Martin, a frequent guest, and great deference to Ken and all the great work that he does, but it is true. You have such ugly anti-Israel rhetoric that it crosses the line between legitimate criticism of Israel into something that's anti-Semitic. What's the totality of that? Of course, our country in the main is fair-minded and a wonderful place for the American Jewish community. That said, coming from extremes in both parties, we're hearing language not heard in a long time in the American political discourse with respect to anti-Semitism.
And it reminds me, as I watch these mobs that are attending the Trump rallies and some of their physical reactions to people who really have a voice to say or question something, it reminds me very much, frankly, of Nazi Germany in 1933 through 1938, and how Hitler stoked up these mobs. Now, I'm not saying that Trump stokes them up, but he also does nothing to stop them.
We all need to be careful with our rhetoric. by the way, and that's
Throw them out. Throw the bums out.
left, right, and center. There's plenty of abuse coming from every element of the political spectrum. Use the word for a second time, it's a cultural problem in the United States now, both it manifests itself politically with refusal of people to act in a bipartisan manner, but the coarsening of our culture, it's not my words, sociologists, social scientists, and the like, is extremely dangerous to our country because we depend upon civil debate.
To our country and to the world.
Into the world.
Yes.
Right.
I would suspect that you are a more conservative individual when it comes to Israel than I am.
Probably
I
true.
am probably a J Street person, and you're probably an AIPAC person.
I would say, look at it this way, Alan. I'm a big tent person. I want to bring all of what you might say the pro-Israel Zionist caucus together. So we may have our differences on an opinion here, an opinion there, an issue here, an issue there. So we can take the best, put it together, and make sure that we have a front that represents the kaleidoscope of opinions, but is ultimately effective.
Well, I am wedded to tradition and history, and in that regard, that's the reason I spent Operation Desert Storm in Israel. I was there 48 hours after the first Scuds fell. But the other side of the coin is I also favor a two-state solution, and I don't think it will ever come to pass while Netanyahu is the prime minister.
You and I have had this discussion. It's so wonderful that you invite me on because we can have these periodic discussions about Bibi.
Dialogues are important.
Dialogue is very important. I won't identify the person with whom I had this conversation, but someone who has been involved in peacekeeping in the Middle East for many years. And I asked him, I say I won't identify, I've not had his permission to quote him by name. And I asked him, what's Bibi's end game? He says, listen, his father is one of the great leading historians of all time. He's got to wonder about where his place is in history. And my interlocutor said, when the right deal comes along, he'll be there to sign it. He's not everybody's cup of tea necessarily, particularly in Israel. Look at the last election results. Nevertheless, he was able to put together his majority in the Knesset. Look what he's doing in Africa. Look at Israel's foreign policy in Africa. Look, he's going to Uganda, Muslim majority country, now having diplomatic relations with Israel. People can criticize Bibi, and people of legitimate and reasonable minds will say that there's sufficient reason to criticize him. But Israel's foreign policy is doing very well right now.
At the same time, he's condoning encroaching further and further with new settlements into areas that were not included in the 1967 lines. And what the result of that is you have these organizations springing up to stop doing business with Israel and things like that. It's so counterproductive for a tiny state that really has more influence, certainly, than one would imagine worldwide for the size of it.
We don't like the BDS movement, if that's what you're referring to, boycott, divestment, sanctions of Israel. By the way, it's a colossal failure for the most part. Israel's trade with the world is growing. Israel does $12 billion trade with China, $6 billion trade with India. The expertise that Israel has to offer the world is so important. And this country...
In terms of certainly technical,
medical,
IT,
technical, agriculture,
medical
the whole
in
works.
particular.
And by the way, and the statistics vary on this, you really have to watch your terms when it comes to the idea that settlement growth, whatever that may be, is somehow a significant impediment to the peace process. Let's level on one thing, Alan. 1948, after the 47 partition plan, 1948, there was not one settlement because, of course, that was an historical impossibility at that time because the 67 war had not occurred. There was no attempt between 48 and 67 when there was not one settlement for any effort to reach out to make peace from the other side. There was nothing to say that it was because of settlements. The war as such as it is right now, is not about settlement. It's about the existential existence. Past part's redundant. It's about the existence of Israel, Tel Aviv, and Rehovot, and Eilat. There's very few people, honestly, if you're going to be taking an honest look at it, who draw this distinction between Green Line Israel and post-Green Line Israel. That said, there are legitimate expressions of opinion in Israel, the Zionist Union, for instance, the main opposition to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who do have their concerns about settlement and that it is somewhat, in their eyes, not helpful to the peace process. But don't get me wrong here. The main impediment to peace is Palestinian and some Arab complete resistance to the idea of Israel.
Well, especially from Hamas.
And Hamas and Hezbollah, exactly.
Right, which has been treated as a terrorist organization
As well
for
it should
years,
be.
including by the United States.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, you can exacerbate a wound, and he has a technique of doing that, which is troublesome to me, and I'm not a native there, I'm not a citizen there, but I have friends who are both natives and citizens there and who have served and who feel the same way. They want peace. And most of the Palestinian people want peace. It's the hardliners that are driving both sides. And I think that he is not the man that his brother was. Let's put it that way.
The incitement level arising from Fatah and the Palestinian Authority is remarkable. You know, the pain of people who commit terrorist acts, naming of streets for people who commit terrorist acts and massacres. Sorry, Alan, the gist of the matter is the fact that, sadly, and putting aside the fact that there are wonderful Palestinian interlocutors too, the main obstacle to peace is Palestinian reluctance is too weak a word. Inability to come to grips with the reality of Israel. That's it. That is the thrust of the problem. Now, does Israel act from time to time in a way that's inimical to the peace process? Sure. No country is perfect. Absolutely the case. And you won't read any more fervent criticism of Israel than in the Israeli press, Haaretz et al., as you know well.
I get both Haaretz
As a
and the Jerusalem
as a well-read
Post.
person that you are.
But yeah, and but moving on.
Yeah.
Relationship with the Catholic Church have never been better.
50 years. This is the 50th
Got
anniversary.
a pope who was really an ecumenical individual and has done so many interesting things.
Well, his relationship, let's start in the personal for Rabbi Skorka and Pope Francis. His relationship with Rabbi Skorka in Buenos Aires, they wrote a book together, they're brothers. They see each other as brothers. But it's almost a metaphor for the way the church has transformed itself in its last 50 years. You know, part of Vatican II was the Nostra Aetate, which was the document that reset theologically relationship between Catholics and Jews. Said deicide was wrong, was an inaccurate description of history. That is the idea that Jews collectively were responsible for the death of Jesus. Anti-Semitism was a sin against God, and that the Jewish covenantal relationship with God remained ongoing. This is worth celebrating, and that's what we've done this last year.
I was disappointed, however, that the Vatican has still not opened up its Holocaust archives, because I think that would be a marvelous move and really beneficial worldwide.
Did I say they were perfect, the relations between Jews and Catholics? No. I mean, there still are issues, but from where we've come over the time has been tremendous, and we've been celebrating it, and we hope to even more deeply engage. And now we've had the commemorations and the celebrations, and now we're working on sort of an educational platform. I have a dear friend, the Archdiocese, Father Eric Rutten. Our new Archbishop Hebda, is a wonderful man, and he's strongly committed to Jewish-Catholic relations. I think there's a lot of Pope Francis in Archbishop Hebda, and we're very fortunate that the Vatican deemed it wise to bring him here on a permanent basis.
I think similarly from what I have read and what I've seen so far. So, did you ever think that we would be this close to a Jewish candidate for the presidency, as Bernie proved? albeit a secular Jew, very secular, but I certainly can relate to that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, when you consider the first Jewish candidate ever to win primaries, right? Any number of primaries, you can name them. I mean, he ran a very hard-fought race. He's got the message that, particularly on the issue of wealth inequality, which resonated with many people. By the way, an issue also present in Israel to a significant degree. With all the wealth that Israel has generated, it's facing the same issue as the United States, the widening gulf between the haves and the have-nots. I wouldn't tell you that Bernie Sanders is necessarily the answer to all my prayers, but I admire him for his courage and the way he conducted himself in the race.
Stymied, interestingly enough, by another Jew, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who, if she didn't throw roadblocks in his path, might have made him the candidate, although I'm very content with the candidate we have and the election that's upcoming. One thing I wanted to touch on really quickly,
sure,
if I can find it here, is what Obama has accomplished with the Iran nuclear deal. And I think he is not given credit for a lot of things, but that in particular, which has been an impediment to world peace, if nothing else.
I'm sorry to say you and I aren't going to see eye to eye on this issue. You know, I admire our president. I admire all of our presidents, by the way. It's something about our country and our democracy that we have to admire our chief executives. They have a remarkably, almost impossible job.
You have a minute and a half to make me look like a fool.
No. You're a very wise man. I would say that you've seen no reduction in the bellicosity of Iran. Hezbollah, who is the patron of Iran, has become even more threatening towards Israel. You had a missile test not 3 months ago in which the tip of the missile said death to Israel. Now, how this somehow validates the president's belief that the JCPOA deal.
Well, I think he's too naive in some regards, but
you got me on that one.
But
Alan.
to quote Steve Hunegs, nobody's perfect.
It's true. Listen, I think the president rightfully will say, on my watch, and probably for the term of the next president, the first term of the next president, whomever that may be, Iran did not acquire a nuclear weapon. Really, the issue is going to be 10 years from now. Dennis Ross, a person who I have boundless respect.
Tremendous
go read his pieces.
individual.
Go read his pieces. He pinpoints this exact problem.
And we're going to have to leave it there.
Yeah, we'll read Dennis Ross.
We have used up our half hour with much more to talk about, so we'll have to get you back here or get you to host some shows.
Well, it's
Steve
a pleasure,
Hunegs,
Alan. You do a great job.
thank you.